I'd like to welcome you to my Thursday Bread History Seminar Workshop. I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Santa Cruz, California. My name is William Rubel. You can find my book, Bread, A Global History, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online sources, possibly also at your public library. I'm writing a larger bread history, and really this work in the seminar series is feeding into this new work that I'm writing. So thank you very much for watching. You can go to my Facebook group, Bread History in Practice, join the group. That's where you will get notifications of the live seminars, and also you will see what people are posting who have attended the seminar. If you want to make breads that are mentioned, then go to my website, williamrubel.com. I don't have all of the recipes from each of these seminars posted, but increasingly I do. So you should look there first in the category seminar. Now I always start with the same two slides. And so I'm going to do that now. For those of you who are new to this group, I always start with the same two slides. A bread is an invention like a chair, a car, a shoe, or a necklace. Every choice that the baker makes, the choice of grain, the way it's ground, the level of grinding refinement, the size of the loaf, whether the crumb is big giant holes like a ciabatta or really fine like a bagel, whether it's a flat bread like a pita bread or a chapati. All of these are cultural choices. I live in California. If I tell a friend, oh, could you go to the store and please buy a loaf of bread for dinner? They're going to come back with a loaf bread. Whereas in New Delhi, they're going to come back with a flatbread. On the other hand, they could come back with the flatbread where I live. They're made and sold. But I would have to say, please bring flatbread for dinner. So bread is a term that means different things to different people depending on where you live. And historically, it also did depend a lot on your social class. It still does today, but we are today going to be delving a bit more back in time and with the recipes by Bonnefons. When you look up in the night sky, if you're fortunate enough to see the constellations, and certainly I will be when I'm on my camping trip with my daughter, there's lots of runes in the sky, but there's no rune for the best bread. The best bread is always something we carry in our heart. It is culturally determined to some extent. Everybody now, not everybody, many of us in the Anglophone world anyway, extending, I know, over to India, are very interested in sourdough breads. But, 40 years ago, that wouldn't have been an interest at all. So today, we're going to talk about the breads of Nicolas de Bonnefons. He wrote a fabulous gardening book I'll talk about very briefly. I think it's going to come up a bit later. And then he also wrote this book, Les Délices de la Campagne. And amazingly, this book, which was published in the 1650s, was translated, the first chapter, the bread chapter, was translated into English by the very, very, very famous, very important, very influential John Evelyn. John Evelyn, I might have a slide on him, so I shouldn't get too carried away. Well, I'll just talk about him now because I'm on it. John Evelyn was an agronomist. He wrote about agriculture. He wrote a cookbook on salads called Assateria in 1699. He was one of the founders of the Royal Academy, which we have the American Academy of Sciences, the French Academy of Sciences. These were all based on what John Evelyn and his friends were doing in London in the late 1600s. So this translation, he started translating this book And then he realized in the middle of it that in the middle of this chapter that he couldn't really manage it, that he couldn't do it. And so he stopped. And eventually, a friend of his named John Houghton, who had a weekly newsletter that reads very much like a blog. Houghton was always name dropping, and Evelyn was one of his most famous friends who was constantly saying, oh, Evelyn said this, Evelyn did that, Evelyn sent me this letter. He finally convinced Evelyn to give him the manuscript, the bread manuscript, and he published it under the name Panathecium. So today we are going to be working, I'm going to go page by page through the Panathecium manuscript. And his translation is good. It's not perfect. We're losing nuance. He didn't really translate every single word, but good enough for today, and historically important. Bonnefons, we know almost nothing about him. He wrote, he lived in the 1600s. He was a valet to the court of Louis XIV. He wrote an incredibly great gardening book called Jardinier François that Evelyn translated as the French Gardiner, Gardiner. And I actually have made an annotated edition of that, which I have a typeset, but I haven't ever published it. I typeset it with margin notes. It will come up a little bit later in this talk. And then Bonnefons wrote this Délices de la Campagne. And he believed in the tastes of the countryside, very simple food, very clean flavors, really a man after the hearts of a lot of people today. He is the one who famously said in the 1650s that the breads of France are known as the best breads in the world. So you're going to see from his recipes, he really cared about bread, and is going to be a great teacher, introducing us to the food ways of early modern Europe. So one thing we're going to see in his recipes that are typical of recipes all the way through the 18th century is that when an author introduced multiple bread recipes, they often were presented in terms of social status. And while it's a real big mistake to think the lords ate white bread and everybody ate shit, what is true is that the lords ate white bread, and so did the educated, what we would say upper middle class. And they ate that in smaller loaves, and their servants ate coarser breads in larger loaves. So one of the loaves we're going to at least look at today, we're not baking, weighs 16 pounds. That's about 7 kilos, 7.5 kilos. And there's this fabulous painting in the Chardin room in the Louvre. And those of you who haven't been to the Chardin room in the Louvre, when you finally are able to go to Paris safely, it's worth going to. That famous brioche painting is there as well, where the brioche is sort of top is cockeyed and a bit burnt. This woman is carrying 2 loaves of bread that are so heavy that she's had to rest them on the bottom on the countertop. So that right-hand loaf could easily weighs many, many kilos. So that would have been a bread that was baked for, not necessarily in the establishment, that was purchased from a baker for her and people in her servant station, and the smaller loaf for the table of higher level servants and perhaps the owners. It doesn't have to be a white loaf. There were sort of family loaves with a slightly less refined flour. On the left is a close-up of a bread in a painting by the Nain brothers. The Nain brothers worked in France, especially in the 1640s, and they painted peasants, and you often see very big loaves on their tables. So to begin, and I'm going to, I don't know how, I might have to end up speeding up, but an account of bread from the learned John Evelyn, Esquire, entitled Panificum, etc. To make excellent bread, not only good corn is preferred to ill, but the goodness of the mill, water, oven, and making ought to be considered. And remember, corn meant wheat. Corn meant wheat, generally. And if you didn't mean wheat by the word corn, then you'd have to modify it. So there's the song planting barley corn. You would have to modify it. And of course, the maize from Central America was called maize. And he says for corn, the fullest and weightiest is the best. So what he's saying is that corn was graded, and you want the one that is a #1 grade. And it was actually literally graded just as corn is graded today in the wheat market. And a #1 wheat weighs 60 pounds per bushel. A bushel is 60 pounds, so that's roughly 28 kilos. The international trade is conducted in bushels because that's what we use in the United States, and we dominate the international trade. So a #1 good grain weighs 60 pounds per bushel, but if your wheat isn't quite as good, it can weigh 58, 56, even as little as 54 pounds per bushel. And what that means is more bran in relationship to the center of the wheat. So you still get the same quality of flour, but you get less of it for what you've purchased. And then he says the grain of the other wheats, be it rye, barley, oats, peas, or vetches, which the poor sort make or mingle with their bread, is not to be accounted. So this rejection of anything that isn't wheat. And as you move down the economic ladder, then you move down to these lower and lower status grains. Here he's saying that the new crop is better than old crop. However, it has more bran, and that's because it's moister. So when I talked about milling, those of you at the milling session, I said that you millers will will rehydrate the grain to bring it up from the 9 or 10% where it has been dried down to up to about 15% to mill. When you do that, you get more bran. So that's what he's saying there. It's a trade-off. And he says you need a good mill, and he is encouraging you to go to the mill, find a mill that has good millstones. And what's interesting about this is it certainly implies that he had a choice, that maybe you had a choice of mills, that there were so many mills that you could sort of find out, through the grapevine, whose grindstone has just recently been fixed. I've mentioned previously that Gervais Markham often says that the black grindstones were best. This is referring to French stone, and maybe some kind of a basalt. I don't know. Maybe Tony Shahan knows. But the stones were varying qualities, and certainly the richer you were, the better quality mill you would have tried to go to.
William,
this is an interesting one where he says, grind as much well-prepared flour as your family can use for a month. And when I was in northern India, in Delhi and Jaipur, I visited many small mills. People still buy grain and take it to a neighborhood mill to be ground. And it seemed that people were buying for 3 weeks to a month. So, but of course, there's risks of insect damage. Water was a big problem in the early modern period, well, all the way up until now, because they didn't have clean, sanitary, municipal water systems, and they weren't able to filter out the minerals if they had a well that was highly mineralized. And so here he's talking about, trying to find a good source of water. And then he brings up something here. He says that water is so principal an ingredient to the making of bread that the goodness of that much improves it. Now, this is very evident in Paris, where the bread, which is made in imitation of that of Gonesse, though by the same bakers and with the same corn, never succeeds either as to the color or goodness equal to that which is made upon the place itself. This is wholly imputed to the excellency of the water. And this is an arcane footnote, but it is kind of, it becomes a central discussion in French bread making through the 18th century. Parmentier, who was a scientist, he actually tested this and he said it's not true. Gonesse is the town, if you look it up right now online. It is between the Charles de Gaulle and Orly airport. It's about 16 kilometers from Paris. And for centuries, it specialized in baking bread for the Parisian market. And their white bread, their bread in general, and especially their white bread, was considered to be superior to that which was produced in Paris. And this went on until the early 19th century. So I have a brief story because I think I do know what the problem was. And it really was the flora that existed in Gonesse was different from the flora in Paris, and the change of the water didn't matter. I have a friend who has a bakery a few blocks from my house, but it used to be 12 miles away. And I have been known, I actually eat everything, and, I'm not really picky, but but I can be, I don't know, we can say critical, but in a friendly way only. And when they moved to this new bakery, Mark, the owner of the bakery, said, William, please don't be disappointed in the bread. When we moved to Watsonville, where the bakery they were moving from, the town they were moving from, it took about a month to stabilize the sourdough. I said, okay, fine. Thanks for the heads up. Well, from day one, this was world-class bread, just incredibly fabulous sourdough bread. I mean, really notable. And it was notable for about 1 month. Now, where I live, you see I'm wearing a sweater. It is July, but it's not hot. It's cool. It's cool. You need a sweater today. And we had a heat wave, so nothing's air conditioned. And it was in 30, 28, 29, 30 degrees for about a month, for about a week. And the flavor of that bread changed completely. It turns out that he had built the bakery in what had been a winery. It was rich with all the flora from fermentation. So I think what Bonnefons says here is probably not true. Now, he starts talking about the oven, and he's saying, build your oven with the thickest sort of brick and work it well in the joints. Let the roof be low. Remember, there's the inverse square law. Radiant energy increases and decreases by the square of the distance. So that means that if you make a change of only a few centimeters, you radically amplify that change in terms of the radiant heat that will fall on your loaf. So if you make your oven thing too high, you're going to cook the bread. It's going to be very, very hard to finish your breads, especially when you're talking about 16-pound loaves. So he says, roof low, mouth narrow, and outside closely plastered. And the bottom of the hearth, which is made of loamy clay, is much to be preferred before firestone or brick tile. Now, the only other place that I've ever seen a reference to loamy clay floors is in Bonnefons' French Gardener. And what you see on the left is from the book that I have written but not published. It's all, as you see, typeset. And he's saying, but the clay, he's talking about double and even triple digging your gardens, if you can imagine that. And this is in the Ile-de-France, so in the land around Paris, apparently a horrible, horrible clay layer. And he says, but the clay, which is sort of earth, where withal the bakers of Paris do make the hearth of their oven, is like a board, so thick and hard that roots can't pierce it. So the gardeners were selling clay when they were digging gardens for the oven floor. And what's interesting is he then says that this is really one of the best descriptions of firing the oven. And one thing that's great about this text is there is detail in this text which does not exist any place else in the written literature. And where I posted the recipe to my website at williamrubel.com, there was a little highlighted PDF. If you click on that, then you will have these texts that I'm showing today, the French Gardener Evelyn translation and the French original. So you don't need to worry, how can I keep track of all of this? Those of you who are really into this, especially the reenactors, and the culinary historians, I've made the texts available to you. So he's talking about a slow firing, not a quick one. And that's really, really, really important. I know you can't see me, so just imagine a brick and imagine a fire, a blowtorch firing the bottom of that brick. The bottom's going to get really hot and you still are going to be able to touch the top. When you remove the heat, if you stop firing it with a blowtorch, then the heat of the bottom of that brick is going to radiate in all directions. It's going to radiate into the air, in this case, into the oven. It's also going to radiate through the brick up towards that outer edge, because also it's one of the laws of physics that the radiant energy is going to want to equalize within the brick. So what he's saying is, in order to get a consistent bake, you have to make sure that the stones or brick of your oven are fully soaked. And then he's telling you what kind of wood to use. And what's interesting is he says it's that clef billet, whatever that is better than bavin, whatever that is, because of the less quantity of ashes, which ought continually to be taken away, that the embers and coals may heat the hearth as well. Now, I have never, ever seen that anywhere. And what he's telling you is, you want to make sure that the floor of the oven is directly contacting coals and isn't being insulated by coals by a big layer of ash. The first bread he mentions is household bread. He says, the more the quantity of bread, the better, yet it is of a good sort of bread for servants, which is made of 4 parts of coarse corn and 1 of barley. And this is a competent proportion for 1 batch. Searce it through the corset sieve, okay? So he's choosing barley, which was at the top of that hierarchy. Well, no, it wasn't. Rye is the best. So it's the second best of the secondary wheats. But he's saying you're going to grind it coarsely. You're going to sift it coarsely. It's not going to be the best bread in the whole world. And he's saying that at 10 o'clock in the evening, take a bushel of this. So again, about 60 pounds or 28, or I'll just say 30 kilos. At night, you put some leaven into it and some of the same meal. And obviously you're going to add some water, which he says in the winter, make it so hot that you can barely endure to put your hand into it. Now, the imprecision of this is very important for you to note. It's the same kind of imprecision that we see in the British sourdough bread recipes. It is not anything like the recipe that we are making, because this is a sloppier bread, sloppier production for the servants. So the next morning, early, leaven the rest of your meal, tempering and eating it a very long time till it be very stiff. For though the softer, more light, or more bulky it appear, yet it will be less lasting. The light bread goes faster away than that which is wrought close. Roughly, obviously, he's just saying is, look, we all love light bread. It's better, doesn't last as long. This dense bread, it'll last longer, and you know, you're making it for the servants anyway. Then he talks about kneading it in the trough, turning it over so the bottom is the top, and then this really clever thing. And for those of you who are reenactors who are doing big quantities of bread, I mean, look at this technique. He says to punch a hole right through the bread all the way to the bottom. And then when it fills, you know your bread is ready to bake. Remember, this bread, very dense, coarse dough, it's not going to puff up and double in bulk. It's not going to double. It is only going to lighten, somewhat like, you know, like rye breads. Heating the oven. He says, now let somebody be heating of the oven. You need a second person. So this is all a 2-person job. And you're going to make a piece which could be 16 pounds each or more. They form them into loaves. And this is absolutely the first mention of using linen to separate the loaves, just like we see in French bakeries today, and that many of us that are are being inspired by the French baking tradition will do at home. And you'll see, you know, baguettes laid out long, sort of set up against each other with a fold of cloth in between. Here is a written example. So those of you who are asking, well, what did they do when? How do I know what I'm doing is from when? These early modern texts can be gold mines. You need to read them line by line by line. But there is support for using that French technique, certainly in France. I'm not saying this applies to England or to Germany, but we know it applies to France. And then he judges the oven temperature, not the way that Hansel and Gretel's witch suggested, not by having a child crawl into the oven to see how hot it is, but rather to draw a stick across the roof, and if it sparks, then that's what he's looking for. Those of you who've never fired ovens, I will talk a little bit about it, but you're going to fire the oven wall until it is white hot, till it's white hot. But what's really important here is he says that he's going to reserve embers. He says right here, make it very clean, reserving. So then you're going to sweep, you know, at the end, you're going to make it very clean. You're going to sweep it out, reserving only a few coals near the mouth. That's the only mention of that I have ever seen. And yet it was a crucial step in making bread. And I'm going to show a photograph of how that works. These coals are going to create an updraft, just like those of you in hot places where there's a lot of flies, you know, there'll be a fan closing a door, you know, above a door, sending down a downdraft. You mop the oven door, then he closes it to let the heat settle. So when you first take the embers out, this oven is going to be up, you know, there at 400 degrees Celsius, you know, something just impossible to bake at. So he's going to allow, you know, the heat to cool by the bricks, by moving within the bricks. And this also has the fabulous detail, again, those of you who do reenacting in big ovens. And an oven, you know, can hold a ton, 1,000 kilos at a time. Load towards the outside, then finish with the inside. So retained heat oven, for those of you who are not familiar with it, you build a fire inside of a dome that is made of a refractory material like clay or brick or stone. And you should think of it like a battery. You are pushing heat into that battery so that when you take the fire out, the heat, which is radiating in all directions, you are going to capture the heat that is radiating into the oven. If you ever want to make an oven, it's really important that you insulate that top super well, because you don't want to be heating the world and cooling your oven. A big problem can be if you do a fast fire in a big oven like this, or like you're seeing on the right, then when you take the fire out and put your bread in, you could have a very fast, precipitous decline in temperature, and your breads won't bake. And I think those of you who were present when I was talking about my dictionary, there's so many words for underbaked breads in the early modern English bread vocabulary. It implies that that was a big problem. And remembering that wood is money, wood is time. It can be cash money, it can be your labor. So someone who was poor, if they had their own oven, or were contributing to a communal oven, skimping on wood would be a place that we'd want to skimp. Now on the right is a photograph by Jean Marquis. He was a Magnum Press photographer. I have his complete set of proof sheets from a photo shoot that he did in France in the early 1960s. I haven't published the book. Actually, publishers weren't interested. They said nobody would be interested in this. And there are some brilliant pictures. This one is not one of the more brilliant ones. And one day I will get to that. And unfortunately, I will be dealing with his estate instead of Jean Marquis himself. But this is what it looks like, the kind of oven that we're talking about today. I took these pictures in Villars d'Arène in the French Alps. you can see the plants have been pollarded in order to make the sticks, the faggots, and in the Bonnefons text, he refers to moving the kindling around, and what he's talking about is faggots. I'm sorry about these strips. I don't know what they are. I can't get rid of those yellow stripes. No idea what's happened. This is the oven. I'm going to show you some pictures in Villard-de-Rennes. It bakes 1 metric ton of bread at the same time. And this is a place where they only bake once a year, traditionally. The family would bake all their bread in one day in November. I will do a separate session on those breads. But this is what it looks like to fire the oven. And here you can see the wood starts on the edge. In this case, it takes 48 hours in order to get this oven up to temperature when firing it for the first time. And it's very beautiful, very magical. Those of you who have never seen it, you really are missing out on something in life. It's worth building or buying a wood-fired oven for your backyard just so you can sit there mesmerized by the fire. This is one of the great pictures by Jean Marquis. And there you see the pile of embers in the mouth of the oven. And this man, and Jean Marquis did not remember his name or even the name of the village, is scoring the loaf, which he then is going to put into the oven over that updraft door. He says, he that heats the oven must be careful that he burn his wood in every part alike, kindling it sometimes at one side, sometimes at the other, and continually scraping away the ashes with his iron. I have never seen that about scraping away the ashes of the iron. And obviously he's talking about a huge, huge oven like I saw in Villard-de-Rennes, where the sides are very, very far apart. So we've got that bread. Remember, we've left it wherever we left it. I guess we've added leaven to it in the morning. And we formed the loaves, and now it's time to put it in. So the bread's put in. We stop the mouth well with a plate door. So this one has a metal door, and the edges are sealed with a wet cloth. I think I've mentioned elsewhere the sealing of the oven with ash, grease, and sawdust. That's what they actually do in the Villard-de-Rennes oven when they operate it today. To hermetically seal it, this man is, Bonnefons recommended sealing it with cloth, and I once saw an oven in France that was sealed with wet newspaper. So you bake the bread till it's done, huge loaves, many hours, just what we're familiar with, the hollow knocking on the bottom. This is the first reference I've seen to that. So you can certainly say in 1650, that is the test for a done loaf. It's very likely was also the test 1,000 years and 5,000 years earlier. Then you draw the batch, and you're going to cool the breads. You're going to let them sit on the sides that were the most baked. And then he talks about the care with which you have to store them. So he's saying in the summer, store it in the cellar. And he's saying, eat the worst breads first. And then he's saying, don't bake again until whatever's left is super, super, super stale. So this gives you some sense of the sort of the cycle of baking. It wasn't that you baked necessarily on a fixed schedule every 10 days, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. You baked when you'd used up your, getting to the very, very end of the previous bake. This magnificent photograph, I'm proud of this photograph and so excited that this is something that I've seen with my own eyes. So this is an oven load of bread from that oven of 6 kilo rye loaves that are cooling in an oven space above the oven in Villard-de-Rennes. So this is also what they're talking about, although Bonnefons suggests cooling them on their side vertically so that it gets better air circulation. We get here into the sorts of French bread, and the first one he mentions is pain bourgeois, or city bread. Now, this is a radically different approach to addressing bread recipes than we see in the English literature. This is something for all of you, whether you're professional bakers or beginning bakers, or any place in between. I'm going to read this whole recipe, and it's way better written in the French, but here we are. Take the 1/6 part of what you intend to make and put leaven into it, making a hole in the dough as you are directed. When the mass is risen, cover with it as much more flour as what there was at first and leave it to rise again. Okay, so you've done a first build, then you're going to, when that is moving, you're then going to add another 1/6 part plus water and let that rise again. And then when it's ready, you add the rest of the flour, the rest of the water, and you knead it, allowing it time to rise, in every particular governing the rest, as has already been described. What's really interesting about these Bonnefons bread recipes, as far as I know, they're the first really book published recipes in France. Maybe somebody, I should really check that with Jim Chevalier, whose fabulous Facebook bread group, the Bread History Lounge, is definitely worth joining. He is American, but fluent in French and the master of the French bread literature. But Bonnefons' recipes, when you read them all together, are nested. So he's telling you how to make, the sort of a master recipe that he refers back to, which is a brilliant way of doing it. But this kind of structure, a 1/6 part, then another 1/6 part for the second build, and then finally the building out the rest. And remember, he's given you instructions. So he's told you, and he's going to tell you another place to start at 8 in the evening and do something else at 10 in the evening. So you can work out from these various recipes, they're not perfectly written, that he would suggest starting at 8 in the evening to do the first mix, 10 in the evening for the second build, and then the morning for the build out. He doesn't mention salt, but I don't think these were saltless breads. So I have salt in the recipe that we were doing. There's this fabulous little sort of random set of notes. And his translation is not as subtle as the original, but this is what we're working with today. The best wheat flour makes the best bread. Again, primacy of wheat. And if you were, I know in some of my talks that I give at conferences, I pick up this idea that I got from Oliver Sacks, who has a book that is called The Anthropologist from Mars. And if you imagine an anthropologist from Mars orbiting Earth in his or her or its space, in its space vehicle, looking down on Earth and reading the crops, having scanned our planet, they're going to see is that wheat is the largest crop by acreage on the Earth. And in fact, 35% of all calories eaten by humans comes from wheat. And if you think about that, it's really quite extraordinary. I must have, well, I don't see. I usually have some wheat lying around, but you all know what it is. It's a tiny, tiny little seed. And I'm not the biggest person in the world, but I'm a pretty big animal, as animals go. So we're this very, very big animal that has conquered the entire world, and most of our nutrition comes from calories, comes from this tiny, tiny, tiny 30%, 35% of our calories comes from this tiny, tiny little seed. It's really extraordinary. Now he says the newest wheat is also the best for bread. The whiter the flour, but this one is fascinating. The whiter the flour, the less goodness in taste. So this idea that you give something up with these pure starches, it's not a new idea. And I think those of you who are culinary historians, you can certainly use Bonnefons as an early reference to this idea. There actually is something in Andrew Dalby's work on the foods of Byzantium, where he quotes someone saying that the rich people, the courtiers, they eat bread that is sort of fluffy like the clouds, you know, airy like the clouds, which certainly is also a critique of the white. But here it says the goodness of taste. And one thing about Bonnefons, there's one point here which I didn't find in the English manuscript, so maybe I read it in the French one, where he says, before you bake your loaf, to take a bit of it the size of a walnut and bake that, taste that, and then adjust your batch. Now, Bonnefons obviously was not a baker, and there's no way you're going to adjust a batch of 100 kilos of flour. But it's a thought that counts. And I think the cultural focus, which is what I want really to be referring to here, is that the French were and are justly reputed to have an unusual focus on the taste of their food. And of course, I think many of us know that even in school, in elementary school and primary school, that the taste of food is part of the curriculum. So here they're saying it tastes better. So I don't know if Amber Lemke is here right now today. She's sometimes with the group. But Amber has this baking mill in Maine called Maine Grains. And she sells a white flour called sifted white. And she gave me a huge sack of it, which I have been using now for the last couple of weeks, 50 pounds of flour. It's fabulous. It's white, but not completely white. It's very close, I think, to a traditional household flour. And the fact is, it tastes better. So I think what he's suggesting is, ultimately, that when you want a really flavorful bread for your family table, then use one that's not totally refined. If you need to show off for a fancy dinner where you don't want taste in the bread, then you might go for a more refined product, like the white wheat refined to the level we saw for fine manchets, double sifted. But I also want to emphasize here, he says, then he says, so the whiter the less goodness. Then he says, the closer it's wrought, so it be not heavy, the more hearty and nourishing. So we talked a bit about heavy bread. So heavy, that is bad. But dense, well, it makes a hearty, nourishing loaf, and that is what's appropriate for the servants. In deciding on the amount of water today, in his recipe that we saw, the first one, you know, he really gives you a range. If you want a nice, dense, hearty loaf, then make it super stiff. But if you want a loaf that doesn't last so long, that is light, then add more water. So for us, I'm doing the more water side because until the COVID-19 thing is over and people have a good range of flours to choose, I'm not certain how we move to the hearty and nourishing loaves. But nourishing also is not necessarily a positive. I think in the early modern English, and hearty is not necessarily a positive. He's talking about nutrition for workers, almost like nutrition for horses. And a hearty bread, it's not what John Evelyn and John Houghton and his friends were eating for dinner. So he's really talking about the quality of bread that you make for your servants there. He says, some make bread as about Rouen and Normandy without at all sifting the bran as it comes from the mill. And this is at first eating seems to be rough and harsh, but by custom, it's both pleasant, wholesome, and very strengthening. So again, I do think that we get this, a tendency we've generalized from a few sources and sort of simplify the bread world. There is no question that the breads of Paris, Parisians have been eating white bread forever and a day. And the authors live in Paris, you know, and when they're writing about the state of bread in France, they're talking about the bread of Paris. There is a fabulous agronomic report by some Frenchmen who visited England. I think it was the 1820s, and they're just utterly shocked. They essentially say, "Oh my God, you won't believe it! The English, they're eating only wheat bread. They don't have rye bread anymore like we do. The French countryside was, the French countryside ate rye bread well through the end of the 19th century. And I think one of the reasons that you see no rye bread, virtually no rye bread in French bakeries, is that they see this white bread, the bread of Paris, as, I do not know what is going on. Ugh, do not know what is going on. Must be an alert from the government. The white bread from Paris was the model, and the rye bread stood for poverty, the feeling of poverty, and they've rejected it. I think that's for another class, but you will see in the Bonnefons recipes that we're dealing with today, they really, there is no rye bread there. The best bread of France, he says, is this bread of Gonesse, and this is the recipe that we're using, and he's giving two versions of it. There is both white and brown, and all sizes. Take 6 bushels of flour, or what lesser quantity you please. So remember, he's getting his recipes from bakeries for sure. 6 bushels, that's 360 pounds. Divide by 2 to get your rough kilo equivalent, 130 kilos of flour, and a ton of water on top of that. Or what lesser quantity you please, which put leaven to a 1/6 part at 8 o'clock at night. Then add as much flour to it. This is called refreshing the leaven. The next morning, early, make your dough with the remainder of the meal, but temper it moderately or very little. Then turn the dough and put it in a wooden bowl. So it's significant that he says you may not need to add more water. So the control of the microbiology of the sourdough starter, and Carl didn't go into it. Carl is on vacation, Carl de Schmidt of Paratus and the Sourdough Library is on vacation the next 3 weeks, so he's not here to speak to this. But the biology of sourdough starters is different depending on how stiff your dough is. So when I get to the class on the bread of Villard d'Arène, what's very interesting there is in Villard d'Arène, they do their starter with a batter. They use all of the water and only 1/3 of the flour. But in the neighboring village of Chazelet, where they want a different taste in the bread, a sour taste rather than the sweet taste that you get from Villard d'Arène, then they have a stiff dough. So he is using a very wet dough, and that is going to favor the lactobacilli, if I understand it. So it's going to be tending towards a sweet side. The next morning, they do everything else, add the rest. Again, he doesn't mention salt. He doesn't really talk about working it very hard, but again, this is implicitly nested with our master recipe. He's rising them in a bowl, which he has floured, sprinkle it, he says, but temper it moderately or very little, then turn the dough and put it in a wooden bowl, sprinkle it with flour to keep it from sticking, and when it's ready to set in the oven, you shall turn it into another bowl, and when it is set into the oven with the peel, the right side may stand uppermost. So he's flipping it. Doesn't mention whether they're scored or not. But I think you do need to imagine that they probably are scored, and definitely that there is this pile of embers that is in the oven door. You can imagine how long it would take to fill an oven that is made with with 350 pounds of flour and another almost 200 pounds of water. Then he has a second bread, and the small light bread is made by taking the sixth part of the meal, and instead of the leaven, set it to rise with new yeast. And when it is swelled sufficiently, wet it again, or work it with another sixth part of the meal, and so let it rise for a second time, and then temper it a very little, turn it, and lay the loaves in a cloth with folds. It looks like I have lost a little section. No, I haven't. Turn it and lay the loaves on a cloth with the folds as previously directed to keep them from touching. Again, they had yeasted bread in France, and we Anglophone speakers, so this is applying to US, Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand, India, Kenya. We, in our current excitement about bread, have borrowed from the French tradition that is only focusing on the levain breads. But in fact, the yeasted breads were there. They've been there for a very long time. Here is another one of the breads that he has, pain à la Montreux. This is the whitest meal. So this one, we're not going for flavor. So remember, this is the same author, Bonnefons, who says, well, if you want the more flavorful bread, you don't necessarily want the whitest flour, but here we do. Here we do. So this is the bread, very similar to the bread we made from Ligier, dated from 1711. Take a bushel of the whitest meal, a fourth part to ferment with half a pint of new yeast. If it be stale, less will serve. A small handful of salt dissolved in warm water, and 3 quarts of milk. And after an hour after the rest, add the rest of the flour, which you shall temper but slightly. Then turn it into a paste, and the wooden dishes. So one important note in terms of language, those of you who are doing research in the English historic bread record, but a warning to you who are working in German or French or Italian, Spanish, some other language. He's using the word meal, which we today always interpret as whole meal, even though if you think about it, if we have to say whole meal, it's like having to say flat bread. It means that even now, meal, well, we take meal to mean whole meal. But even by the fact we often will say whole meal, does suggest that this older meaning, where flour and meal, they can be the same thing. So we've got the whitest possible flour. So that is through that 21 shilling cloth, 315 microns for those of you who are millers. And if he's saying the whitest meal, it might be double sifted, like for the fine manchet, where you run it through the 315 micron cloth, and then you run it again through that cloth, being very careful not to push all the way. You'll remember the reference from the 1550 manuscript by T.T. saying, sift it, but don't go too far. Don't push it. So as soon as you start seeing the color change from whitest white, you're done. So you will not be looking for efficiency in that sift. So this is a very expensive bread. And it is like a modern sandwich bread. It is lightly enriched. It's made with yeast. It has milk. And he says, of this sort of bread and that of Gonesse is made biscuits, cutting it in halves and taking out the crumb, and so set into the oven. But first it must be sprinkled with aqua vitae. Some add to it fennel seed, beaten and scattered into the dough, and aqua vitae as you temper it. This is an excellent biscuit to be sopped in muscadel wine, canary, or what wine you please. So I do suggest you think about this as a recipe. It was a common early modern use of bread. So it's right there. And again, when you go to my website, williamrubel.com, and to this posted recipe for today, then you'll find the link to the PDF that will give this to you.
William, before you change the slide, Deanna Berkmeyer asks, what does it mean to temper the bread? Is that referring to kneading it?
No, tempering is to add the water to it. So in early modern English, you temper means is adding the water, the liquid. Okay. And I think we're very close. This is just about the last slide. Almost the last slide. No, it is the last one. So there's also two little miscellaneous notes about stale bread that we all know. If you heat bread, it goes back close to normal. If you want to know why, then you will find a very good explanation in Harold McGee's book on the science of food, Curious Cook, I think it's called, but you can just look him up. Harold McGee lives in San Francisco, a wonderful man, and maybe one day I can bring him here to speak to us in this class. But I included this note because cherry wine yeast, the ferment of cherry wine, makes an excellent yeast for bread. So experiment, have fun, make some fruit wines this season. This is past cherry season for those of us in the northern hemisphere, which is everybody in this group. But at least I think it is. It's end of cherry season, and where I live has been over for a few weeks. But I'm sure that plum would also make a very nice wine. So I'm going to stop sharing. And we can now start mixing. I should say, any questions for a few minutes before we start mixing, or should we start mixing and then do questions? How does the group feel? What's the feeling?
I think Richard has a question and also a comment from somebody about ovens.
Okay.
My question was about the use of aqua vitae poured over the half biscuit. I mean, aqua vitae, meaning any kind of strong flammable spirit, seems like a strange thing to do.
Well, I mean, I think they're thinking of you know, like Slivovitz, you know, plum brandy and apple brandy. It's a brandy. Give it a very nice flavor. It would be lovely.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm saying that off the top of my head, guys. So maybe we shouldn't say that I haven't researched that, but that's what I think. If we can see behind me, well, we can, but I have my plum wine just finished. I'm about to distill to make my own. And anise was considered to be very medicinal, and so we still have, you know, the anisette, the anise biscuits that, you know, in the Italian bakery, you or Italian cafe that are given out with your amaretto cookies. That's from this tradition. Although the amaretto cookies are an egg white mixture, but in Mexico bakeries, I've seen the rolls hollowed out and sold as crisp breads. Another question?
Peter, do you want to talk about radiance in ovens?
So this is just a minor little thing. The inverse square law you mentioned only refers to point sources, not large sources like the surface of an oven. It's actually a theoretical thing of a point in space,
but
in all directions.
Right. But the amount of heat radiating onto my hand from an oven ceiling that's there is going to be a lot different than if it's here.
It is, but it's not to the square. It doesn't.
It's not fully to the square.
It's not
but
exponential. It's actually a linear amount.
Oh, it is linear amount.
Yeah,
well,
you have to do the integral of the entire surface, and that comes out into a linear amount. Once again, that's in space. Because you're in an enclosed area, it actually falls off less. One of the magic things the reasons oven work nicely and some of the home convection ovens don't work is because in the old ones, they actually created a fantastic radiant box, the old cast iron ovens. The whole box got hot just like in the stone ovens or the clay ovens, and which is a beautiful source of radiant energy that doesn't fall off a tremendous amount when you have an enclosed space.
Okay. Well, Peter, thank you. I stand corrected, and I'll talk to you more about that because I've been
Yeah.
saying this inverse square and even published it many, many times. Nonetheless, the height of the oven does make a big difference, and an oven that is specialized for pizza, for example, the oven roof will be much closer to the floor than one that is for bread. All right, another question or any other
I
thing
think
anybody
Jeff
wants
has
to
his
say?
hand up.
Who?
Jeff?
Jeff Pavlik?
Yes, how you doing? Thank you
Very
very
well.
much for this. So my question was on the, I'm glad you pointed out that this, like, it has a master recipe that he's working around. He has kind of a technique for this in the beginning for this two-stage mixing. In the best French bread recipe, it really just has a one-stage mix and that I read. And in the instructions that you printed for us last night, you added a second mixing stage in it. And I went with your instructions just so we could all stay on the same page. But do you see it as like a master recipe? Like, what do you see as the master recipe, and then what is the variation? Because I think you hit on that earlier, and it was really
Okay.
interesting. And I don't know if you actually
I
finished
think
your
that-
thought on it.
Okay, I think there's some carelessness and problems with Evelyn translation, and I just, I'm overloaded in life, and I didn't have time to compare back and forth, and there could be carelessness in the Bonnefons original, but I don't think so. But in any case, putting together the different bits, the master recipe, and then reading this poor translation, I think what's really clear is his standard is you divide the dough into 6 parts conceptually. You take one part and then you add your leavening to it.
Correct.
And then a couple hours later, and you do that at 8 p.m. And a couple hours later at 10 p.m., you add another 6th part and more water, or maybe not. He's unclear about, sometimes he just says add more flour. So obviously that doesn't work unless it began as a batter. And it could be a batter because, as I said in Villard d'Arène, it is a batter. It is a batter.
I mixed
So-
mine. Yeah, I mixed mine with 1/3 of the water in each stage. It was a 3-stage mix, and I used 1/3 of the water each time, and it was perfect.
Yeah. So I made mine very, very wet. But anyway, so I think so to me, that's the master recipe. And I will now sit down and focus on it and clarify it. And it's brilliant, guys. This is like the ultimate to use. And I'm changing, in my redaction today, I had 50% starter to that first one. So if it was 100 grams of the flour, it was 50 grams starter. That could easily be just 25%. And I put in way a lot of yeast. I wasn't testing it, and I wanted to be certain that everybody was successful. But this would be a time, I'm sure, for only 1/4% yeast. That looks
Well,
very nice.
This is mine that came out. I started last night at 6 p.m. so that I could bake it and get out of the bakery in time. But this was the recipe that you printed that I followed, and it was primarily the 2/6 were white whole wheat, and then the majority of the flour was Michigan pastry flour. So it's like a low protein flour.
Very
So
nice.
it was
And that
excellent. Tastes fantastic.
and that replicate the period there. And for those of you who are doing a lot of work, mostly in English breads or American breads, there's no example in our literature of anything that is structured. And structure lets you think about what you're doing. So with that, let's mix, and then we can talk a bit afterwards. So I'm gonna go get mine and see what states it's at. And I'll be back. Just take me 1 second. I wasn't even certain it was going to work. My starter was so awful.
William, you were
Yes?
accidentally muted for a second. So do you want to just start from when you started showing the
Oh, I was muted.
yes.
Okay. So this is mine, and it's more, it is more than doubled. I added the flour this morning, and it's got, you know, it smells lovely. Mine is made with Amber Lemke's main grains, sifted white, so it's gray because it's it's closer to an historic household flour. Again, this recipe, in terms of how much water, it really is up to you whether you want to make a dense bread or a not dense bread. I think it's really clear they did it many different ways. I would use this as a master recipe, and I would start using it. I think it's a brilliant recipe. Very, very good in hot climates where you could reduce the starter to very small amounts and have it be rising overnight. And obviously you could make that milk instead of water. You can add some eggs, you can add butter, you can do anything with it. So I love this structure and I use it all the time. Any other questions?
William, as to the form of the bread, are you making a loaf or are you making several smaller rolls?
This is not for rolls, but you can make rolls. But I mean, he's talking about, I think he's talking about loaves, you know, bigger loaves. So I'd make the whole thing as a pound loaf, but you can do anything with it. Again, he doesn't really, that's not central to in the set of his recipes. The final form is not that important. Obviously, he's saying the 16-pound loaf is one humongous loaf, but if you want to make rolls, make rolls. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me? If my sourdough starter isn't strong enough, and it takes too long to rise, that's when it gets sour, right? So my answer today, I in fact just finished mine here. Turned out really well. I put in about a half a teaspoon of dry yeast.
Yes.
And then
So
the timing works perfectly.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, Margaret. I'm glad you brought that up. So, you know, one sort of strange characteristic, I think, of our current culture is we're very autocratic and very linear and very rigid in our thinking. And in Bonnefons' period, it wasn't that way, even in the 18th century. So Parmentier, while he says, you know, he was a big proponent of levain breads, writing in the 1770s and 1780s. But he also said, you know, if it doesn't move, it doesn't rise, add a little yeast to it. And there is a recipe by Gervase Markham in The English Housewife that combines both sourdough and yeast. It's one of the few English sourdough recipes. That's from 1615. He has it rise overnight with the sourdough. He adds the yeast in the morning. Make your bread work. And remember, there is a yeast in that starter. Remember, what makes the starter bubble up is yeast. And as Carl explained from the sourdough library in Belgium, that yeast is almost surely to be Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same yeast in the packet. So you already have yeast in that starter. You're not contaminating it. You know, I know there's this feeling in the artisan bread world a bit about the purity of flour, water, leavening, and salt, thinking of it in the same context as the Bavarian, the very, very, very famous ancient Bavarian purity rules about beer, that there are only certain ingredients that are permitted in beer. And, you know, we shouldn't be thinking, don't think that way. It isn't, it's not empowering. Because also remember, the only way you can fail with bread, there's only a single way, and it's a guaranteed way to fail. And the way to fail is to follow the times in a recipe, to say, it's risen in an hour and a half, it's said an hour and a half, and throw it into the oven when it actually didn't rise. And then you're going to fail. So if your sourdough starter isn't strong enough, add yeast, and there's no police. Again, looking up in the night sky, you know, just think of my little night sky drawing, okay? In the night sky, there's nothing up there. There's nothing up there. There's no constellation, and there's no God that's going to come down to you and say, you have committed a sin, you have added yeast to your bread. Okay, another question.
William, I have a question that's kind of the opposite of Margaret's. I was emailed by a friend whose wife has been making bread from sourdough starter, and they want their sourdough to taste like San Francisco sourdough. She's baked 4, 5, 6 times, and it's never sour enough for them. How can they get their bread to be sour?
Okay, William is not a master baker. I will venture a reply, but I'm going to expect Jeff, and if Michael from Florida is here to speak. So
Sure, William?
You talk first.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to last week's amazing voyage into all those different sourdoughs, and we talked a lot about the different kinds of yeast that are in those sourdoughs, but we really didn't focus too much on the bacteria. And really, it's the bacteria that give you a lot of the flavors. The yeast are giving you a lot of the power to make carbon dioxide, to leaven bread, but it's the bacteria and the microfauna that live in alongside symbiotically in your sour that give you unique flavors. And in the case of San Francisco sourdough, you have to be living in San Francisco. I mean, that's what gives it its flavor. That's outside of whatever, when you make a sourdough in your home, you have like your home's flavor. That's what lives in your house. And those, what Puroto's has done is they've taken those sourdoughs and they've broken them down into their characteristic biology and then dried it. And so you can add the sour. Remember how we talked about adding sour to your bread? You're just adding those bacteria flavors that they've been able to isolate, and then you can like get that San Francisco tang. But you're not going to grow San Francisco biology in wherever you live. That's my understanding of it.
So let me refine that some. Thank you, Jeff.
Sure.
Let me refine that somewhat. First of all, there is no sourdough baking tradition in San Francisco. What there is now, but there is everywhere. What there is in San Francisco is a bakery called the Boudin Bakery. And this was founded in the 19th century by French bakers. And they have been making a sourdough bread forever. They're French bakers. And what we learned from the Puroto's library is that the sourdough starter from the Klondike tastes very, very, very sour. There is a bacteria that was isolated in San Francisco from a San Francisco sourdough that's called something like Lactobacillus san franciscus. That's not exactly right, but it exists all over the world. It's not unique to San Francisco. But I would assume that the Boudin Bakery's sourdough starter, and that's the sour taste you get when you buy the bread at the Fisherman's Wharf or at San Francisco at SFO Airport. That is a starter that is particular to that bakery, and we don't have it. There are ways to make your starter more sour. One is to add rye flour. So Hei-Chung, I would suggest your friend do that first with rye flour. I also think you'll make it more sour if their starter is dense. Remember looking at all of those jars in the bakery, and some of them were completely dense dough. I mean, you wouldn't even make your fingers sticky. Others of them clearly were more dough-like. You could see the bubbles. but I think Jeff is right. I don't think Jeff is right that anyone in San Francisco can get that flavor. But I think that particular flavor is coming from that bakery, and you need that starter.
Would it also help for them to leave their sourdough starter out on the counter all the time so that the higher temperature would help those bacteria to grow?
Well, we don't know how the Boudin bakery maintains their starter. But it's a bakery, so they're refreshing it presumably every single solitary day.
So they don't refrigerate.
So remember, they may. I don't know. I think we should wait. We should wait for Carl to be back, or someone else who's more scientific. But they need to refresh at the same time in the same way every day. It's to get the exact same effect. And I would suspect, if you go online, that there's a wonderful bread website called The Fresh Loaf. It's an old-fashioned bulletin board. The Fresh Loaf, it's very, very reputable. And that goes for everybody here, wherever you are in the world. The Fresh Loaf is a good source of information. There's somebody saying that the dominant bacteria in San Francisco in that starter is Lactobacillus sanfranciscensis. They actually changed that name. But yes, that note is very good. Is very good.
Can I
All right.
just-
One more question before we move into just the Zoom room time.
I was just going to add to that discussion. The bakery in Northampton, Massachusetts, south of me, makes very sour bread. I don't know if it has the taste qualities exactly of San Francisco, but the baker there probably is trying to approximate that. So it's possible to keep a culture out of San Francisco that will give you the acid flavor if you want to. And I don't know the detail of it, but William's right. The Fresh Loaf, if you search the forums in thefreshloaf.com, you'll find plenty of discussion of ways to manage your sourdough to produce either a sweeter or a more sour taste.
That's the Hungry Ghost, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes,
Wonderful
indeed.
bakery.
And just to say about their culture, Jonathan the baker showed me once in a 5-gallon bucket, it was about 3/4 or 4/5 full of a liquid leaven, and bubbles were coming up. It was really alive. So this is the working tool of working bakery.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Okay, so I'll stay here. Thank you all for coming.